All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the massive geopolitical shifts, the horrific battlefield realities, and the incredibly complex aftermath of the First World War. We are going to look closely at the entire narrative arc of this global tragedy. Literally the whole story, from the spark that started it to how it was fought on land and sea, the social paradoxes it stirred up at home, and exactly how it finally came to a grinding halt.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll hit 1. The powder keg ignites. 2. Deadlock on the Western Front. 3. Terror from the seas. 4. Fighting for hollow democracy. 5. The collapse and armistice. And finally, 6. Redrawing the world map.
Okay, Section 1, the powder keg ignites, the structural causes of a global conflict. To understand how the entire world went to war, we really have to look at the incredibly complex structural forces that were building up for decades.
You know, the era leading up to the war was defined by a totally toxic balance of power. It's often remembered by the acronym MAIN. That's M for militarism, basically this culture of deep paranoia and intense military competition. A for alliances, which was a massive, tangled web linking powers into opposing camps like the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Then there's I for imperialism, this fierce global competition for colonies. And finally, N for nationalism, which was a wildly powerful new source of tension. Put them all together, and you get a giant powder keg just waiting for a match. So you might be wondering, why 1914? Why not before? A lot of these tensions had existed for years during previous crises. Academics constantly ask why the spark finally caught fire in 1914, rather than, say, 1905 or 1911. Well, it comes down to preventive logic. Leaders were terrified of shifting power dynamics, like the rapid rise of Russia, and this pushed military brass to advocate for a preventive war, while they still believed they had a shot at a quick, decisive victory.
It is honestly staggering how fast the dominoes fell here. It all starts in June 1914 with the assassination of the Austria-Hungarian heir Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo. That single, fateful event triggers the July crisis, which was basically a solid month of catastrophic diplomatic miscalculations. By early August, Germany executes a modified Schlieffen Plan invading neutral Belgium to bypass French defenses. And boom, just like that, Britain is instantly dragged into the war. The whole world is essentially at war in a matter of weeks.
Section 2. Deadlock on the Western Front. The meat grinder. You see, the soaring pre-war rhetoric about a glorious, swift victory, that crashed headfirst into the grim, mechanized reality of modern combat. At first, the German army swept through Belgium incredibly fast, executing that Schlieffen Plan. But they were decisively halted just outside Paris at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. French and British troops basically found a gap in the advancing German armies, exploited it, and forced them to retreat. What followed was this frantic race to the sea, where both sides just kept trying to outflank each other until they literally hit the ocean and had to dig static defensive lines.
And that brings us to trench warfare. The crucial point here is that both sides completely lost their mobility. We're talking about fortified defensive trenches stretching all the way from the North Sea down to the Swiss frontier. It created a brutal, unmoving deadlock. Just thousands of miles of mud, disease, and barbed wire. Desperate to break this stalemate, military leaders unleashed terrifying new tech. Poison gas, aircraft, eventually even tanks. But even with all that horror, the lines barely moved for 3 whole years.
That takes us to Section 3, Terror from the Seas. Breaking the blockade. Because with the land war totally stalled out, Germany turned to a radical counter-blockade strategy on the high seas to try and starve Britain into submission.
Using submarines or U-boats as commerce raiders completely upended international prize law. Traditionally, naval rules meant you had to stop, search, and safely evacuate a merchant's crew before you could sink it. But submarines? They literally couldn't do that without being destroyed themselves. This radical shift led to the tragic 1915 sinking of the British passenger liner, the RMS Lusitania. 1,198 civilians died, including 128 Americans, which, as you can imagine, severely strained Germany's relations with the neutral United States.
Take a look at these numbers. In early 1917, Germany rolled the dice and resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, betting they could paralyze the British economy before America could intervene. And the destruction was absolutely catastrophic. It peaked in April 1917, with over 860,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom of the ocean in a single month. To put that into perspective, it's no coincidence that this massive spike in destruction happened the very same month the U.S. officially declared war. Ultimately, though, the Allies adopted the convoy system, which ended up neutralizing this terrifying U-boat threat.
Section 4. Fighting for hollow democracy, a social paradox. As American troops marched over there to join the fight, the sweeping political rhetoric used to justify the war created a really painful paradox for marginalized communities back home.
Think about this. President Woodrow Wilson demanded war by proclaiming that the world must be made safe for democracy. But that slogan rang painfully hollow for a lot of people. African-American soldiers valiantly fought to liberate Europe, only to return to a nation where they literally didn't even have full political liberties. They came home to systemic disenfranchisement and the horrific Red Summer of 1919, which was a massive outbreak of racial violence and terrorism across at least 26 U.S. cities. A truly stark contrast.
Moving on to Section 5, the collapse and armistice. The machine breaks. By 1918, 4 years of just unimaginable economic, societal, and human strain culminated in a sudden, dramatic collapse. 1918 was an absolute roller coaster. Russia actually withdraws from the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That move releases 33 veteran German divisions to the Western Front. So Germany takes these troops and launches a massive spring offensive, pushing deeper than anyone had since 1914. But they just couldn't sustain it. The offensive totally exhausted their military, which completely opened the door for an unstoppable Entente counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive, and that caused a sudden, total collapse of the German armies.
Facing internal revolution at home, completely depleted manpower, and just total military exhaustion, the German imperial monarchy collapsed. A new, moderate government stepped in and immediately sued for peace. And so, on November 11, 1918, they signed the Armistice of Compiègne. After 4 agonizing years, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent.
The scale of the slaughter here is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Looking strictly at military deaths on the Western Front alone, we're talking about over 2.4 million Entente soldiers killed and nearly 1.6 million Central Powers soldiers. Let that sink in. Entire generations of young men left buried in the mud of France and Belgium. It is a deeply sobering reality of modern industrialized warfare.
Which brings us to our final act, Section 6, Redrawing the World Map, the Fallout. Because while the guns may have stopped, the 1919 Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles kicked off a chaotic dismantling of centuries-old global empires.
Basically, overnight, 3 massive empires that had stood for centuries, the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, just vanished. Millions of people were left completely disoriented, living in countries they didn't even recognize. And what's really fascinating here is that the so-called experts drawing these new national borders weren't economists. They were historians and geographers. They were literally carving up new nations for political reasons, often totally ignoring whether these new states were economically viable. And those hasty decisions laid the groundwork for geopolitical conflicts that we are quite literally still seeing on our news feeds today.
So I want to leave you with this final thought, and it's a big one. Did the arbitrary redrawing of these borders doom the peace from the very start? Considering the fragile, economically disconnected map hastily drawn at Versailles, was the peace that followed always destined to fail? Was the Second World War really just the inevitable sequel to a poorly concluded First World War? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history around you.